Rick, are you ready to start talking about the history of mythicism?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. So, first of all, I guess I kind of wanted to set this up a little bit is, does the history behind mythicism, like leading up to your on the historicity of Jesus, like wherever the academic community was or had or whatever they had done, does that really have a lot of effect on whether or not it's true, or did it have any effect on the historicity of Jesus?
No, not really. So first of all, like knowing the historiography of a thing is only rarely useful to understanding the true facts of the thing, right? So like it's useful to know the history of the historicity of Jesus, the history of the three quests and so on, because then you can see all the different ways that things have succeeded or failed. You can see what has been tried before, what has been proposed, and so on. But all of that, most of that is actual like peer-reviewed academic studies going back 100 years, right? So studying the quests can be useful. It isn't necessarily going to help you answer the question of what is the evidence now, right? Like, 'cause you've got to, did Jesus exist? You got to list the evidence essentially, and then assess the evidence one way or another. And knowing the deep history of the quest for the historical Jesus is going to inform that very little. Like you're looking at the end product of all those failures, basically, right? So like knowing the history of all the failures doesn't help. What the field is doing is the vanguard of the field today will be all the collected stuff that's held up or at least survived that long. Everything that was bad is generally going to get chucked away. Now, occasionally something good gets chucked away. And so those are the gems that you find. But when you find those things, it's not by studying the history of the quests, it's by studying a specific issue. And the example would be when I did my postdoc study that resulted in the peer-reviewed book on the historicity of Jesus. One of the things I came to realize was the whole Barabbas narrative, right? The whole idea that, oh my gosh, the whole Mark 6 or Mark 15, that whole thing is just the Yom Kippur. And you have Jesus, son of the Father, and then you have this other Barabbas, son of the Father, and you have the two goats. One atones for the sins of Israel, one carries the sins of Israel. I mean, it's all makes perfect sense as a Levitical allegory. And I thought, like, well, am I the first one to notice this, right? And so I did a literature review, and I found that it had actually been independently discovered at least 2 times in the literature, but it just kept getting forgotten. So it didn't survive in the collection of stuff. If you go reading the vanguard literature today, that point rarely comes up. It's an obscure at all. And even the 2 authors I found, I didn't even know about each other, right? So it's this, basically the wheel keeps getting reinvented. The same thing keeps getting rediscovered, which is a good sign, because if 3 independent people, completely independent of each other, are seeing the same thing in the text, that actually is supporting that you probably are seeing something that's really there, right? So anyway, but that didn't require me to study the history of the quests, right? It just required me to do a literature review on that one question, deep literature, who's written on this before, search the databases and so on, and read the articles. So you don't really need to know the history of Jesus, right? But it still is interesting and is valuable. And I would say the same thing is true for mythicism, except with one major difference is that almost all mythicism has been garbage. To be honest, right? Like it's not peer reviewed. A lot of it is amateurish. A lot of it is crank, easily strawmanned. I mean, it is strawmans itself. Like that's what I mean. It's like, it's so bad. There's been very, very little peer reviewed mythicism in history. We had a short bout of it in the early 20th century. And then it got shut down. Like basically the Shirley Jackson case wrote a book and everybody assumed that it had been refuted. And then it doesn't get revisited very much at all for roughly 100 years, a little less than 100 years. And then I published my book. Now the idea comes up occasionally in the literature, but no one really like assiduously explored the hypothesis, pro or con. Right? Like no one wrote a book about it. Did Jesus exist? Like that's not a thing. What they wrote about was which historical Jesus is true. So they just assume historicity, and then on that assumption, try to argue what type of Jesus, what was the historical Jesus? Was he a zealot? Was he a pacifist? Was he a stoic? Was he a cynic philosopher? Was he an apocalyptic prophet? Was he a Buddhist? Like we can find all of that stuff in the literature. Some of it ridiculous and some of it not. So what happened was when I was at the Secular Web as editor-in-chief, well, first the feedback editor, I was a very snarky anti-mythicist feedback editor, and then editor-in-chief. And one of the things that out of my frustration as I wrote way back then was my article against Kersey Graves, because I was sick and tired of people citing Kersey Graves as 16 crucified saviors at me. And I'm like, no, that's garbage. That's not reliable scholarship at all. And so I wrote my article about not only that it was wrong, but like what things to look for, like why it was wrong, and why you can find in other works, like you can look for to see like what is the difference between quality and garbage argument. And anyway, so I was rabid anti-mythicist, and at that time all we had was the woo stuff like Acaria S, Dorothy Murdoch's sun god astrotheology worship stuff, and Joseph Atwill's like the Roman government invented Christianity, like the weird conspiracy theory that he has. Those are the only things that we had were those kinds of ridiculous things. Freak and Gandhi was another commonly, the Jesus mysteries. It was very, very terrible. Neither of them is a competent historian, and it was very badly argued. And it wasn't peer reviewed. So peer review would have made a much better work of it. So anyways, we had a lot of terrible stuff. So it was easy to debunk and easy to reject. And you could easily say like, no, this is terrible. There's nothing to learn from this. It would be it's so much work to debunk it. It's just a waste of time to even read in the first place. So that was the state of things until various number of different people whose opinions I respected convinced me to read Earl Doherty's book. And they said, no, this is different. This is not astrotheology. It is not the conspiracy theory stuff. This is like a serious academic argument. And it looks convincing, but we're not historians. You are now. Like, would you do a review of this? And enough people told me this to convince me to do it. And I read Doherty's book and I realized, yeah, this is actually a cut above all of that stuff. It was actually almost like dissertation quality. In fact, when I did my review, I have like the criticism section where all the points that I would criticize, which would basically have been if I were his dissertation advisor and that was a dissertation, my list of things would be fix all these things and you'll pass, right? Like he was close to a pass. He just had to like adjust essentially, right? And that's what a good peer review would do that too. You would get a report back that says, hey, this is salvageable, but you have to fix these things for it to be publishable. And you do that in much more detail if you're a dissertation advisor or on a dissertation advisor committee for someone who's doing a doctoral dissertation. So I think what he had was a really good first draft of a doctoral dissertation. And it totally, he had the means and the skills to have taken it all the way. Had he ever, had the money to get into a PhD program to do it, but he never did. He had other plans in life and did his own thing. But what this did is it led me to realize that, okay, so there's a decent case to be made. It's still not peer reviewed. There's still not a proper academic response to it. This put me in an academic sort of agnostic position where I was like, well, I'm not sure now, right? And then, of course, in 2008, and this might be come up later, in 2008, the economy collapsed. And that just wreaked havoc everywhere, right? And one of the things it is freeze on hires for humanities majors. So there were no jobs there were no professorships to get, right? They're either eliminating positions or not hiring for them. And the few positions there were being gobbled up by people who, have long history of teaching and want their choice plum positions or whatever. So basically getting a job for a newly minted PhD was impossible in 2008. I would have to have waited like 3 or 4 years to even have a chance to get into the market. I had actually burned out on academic, politics by then. So I did not like the job of professor. I saw what it was like from inside. Being a professor is a shit job. I do not recommend it. There's so many things that are terrible about it. Interdepartmental politics, they overwork you, like they stick you on a million bullshit committees. The infighting over who gets what office, who gets what hours for which classes, and the sort of petty backstabbing. I mean, it was just miserable. And I was like, I don't like this. It totally blew away my romantic notion of what a professor was, right? By that point, I was thinking, like, can't we just do research and teach? Like, why do you have to ruin the job with all this other crap? And then, of course, at the same time, they were hugely cutting the salaries, right? So they were, first of all, eliminating tenure positions. So the number of tenure positions are shrinking. And they're replacing professorships with adjunctships, which actually pay less than minimum wage. So these are PhD people. When you add up the hours you have to do to manage these courses, you're getting less than minimum wage. And so adjuncts, you can Google this, and adjuncts complain about the destruction of academia with the whole recourse to adjuncting, which is a for-profit. It's basically just corporations, universities acting as corporations trying to get work for free. But but anyways, it ruined the market. And so you add that, the collapse of the economy. So I went to my fans and I said, hey, look, if you can help me cancel my $20,000 of student debt, get me a research grant that covers that, I'll devote my PhD to any subject you want. And unanimously, everybody who wanted to put into this fund said, Historicity of Jesus. We don't care if it's true or false. We just want to hear your judgment on it. And that resulted in my postdoc research project, which resulted in the books, right? So Proving History and then On the Historicity of Jesus. That wouldn't have happened had none of those other things happened. Like if I hadn't been funded to do it, I didn't care enough about the issue to devote so much time and effort to it. But the end result was it made me like one of the world's leading experts on the historicity of Jesus, because I spent 6 years studying nothing but that, and then getting the first book to systematically argue the case one way or the other that had been published under peer review in almost 100 years. The last one was Case, which their second edition was the early 20s or late 20s, 1920s, right? So I forget now. We're in the 2020s now. So and then mine came out in 2014. So almost 100 years before anybody had done anything. And so that changed my position. And the whole goal at that point, now what we've got Historicity of Jesus on a peer-reviewed basis that actually is meeting the standards of the field and is actually doing the things that all the Historicity of Jesus stuff had been doing for the last 100 years. So if you do the quests for the historical Jesus, most of that is peer-reviewed scholarship over the last 100 years. There's something substantive to follow there. Whereas there hasn't been that tradition for mythicism. There's this huge 100-year gap where it was just all garbage and nobody was applying, PhD skills to this properly to do this. And so mine is the first. Raphael Latastre came out with a follow-up study that gets roughly the same results, and he published that with Brill in 2019. So now we have two peer-reviewed books arguing that Jesus probably didn't exist, or that we can't say he probably did. And still, there's been no book since Shirley Jackson Case in the 1920s. There's been no book doing the other side of that through peer review. So we have not yet had a peer-reviewed book arguing for the historicity of Jesus, which is a problem. And I think that's a problem that the field needs to address. And I hope they do address it soon, because now it's 2-0 for the 21st century on this. But that means that there's very little to study for the history of mythicism, because it's all crankery. It's the history of crankery, right? It's the history of, Joseph Atwill. Before that is the Piso. He just revamped the Piso conspiracy, which is not the real Piso conspiracy, which was for the assassination of Nero, but the fake made-up crank Piso conspiracy, where the Piso family supposedly invented Christianity for purposes of the Roman Empire or whatever. It's a dumb theory. But you have that thread, so there's a history of that, but who cares? It's all bullshit. So why do you want to know the history of it? It doesn't help you. There's a history of astrotheology. There's been a lot of really good peer-reviewed work on astrotheology for other religions, like Mithraism, for example. David Ulanzi's book on Mithraism is a classic in astrotheology. But there's not been any, Christianity does not originate. None of the early Christian works have anything to do with astrotheology. Even if that stuff creeps in later, it's not in the origins of Christianity. So all the astrotheology stuff that goes back more than 100 years is just all crank, ridiculousness. There's also the sort of the Kemetic theory that the Christianity is entirely ripped off from Egypt. It's like point by point. It's just completely ripped off from Egypt. That's also false, but that has its own history. There's a whole history of that goes way back. So you could, and also, there's others like that, but there's a lot of weird things on the side. There's theories that the Gospel of Mark started out as a play, and it was just a play, and then people started believing it, and that started Christianity. And then there's the theory that Christianity was really just Buddhism, that Jesus went to India, learned some Buddhism, and came back, and it was really just all misunderstood Buddhism. So there's been a lot of weird stuff like this that hasn't passed peer review. It's all crankery. So studying the history of it is interesting for people. I value people who are doing it. So I think the fact that Chrissy Hansen is building literature that's sort of basically creating this bibliography of here's a bunch of the history of this crank movement, is valuable in and of itself, right? The history of the history is valuable in and of itself, but it has no value for answering the question of whether Jesus existed or not, because it's all been crank, right? Not all of it, but like you really got to look at the history of like the peer-reviewed stuff. And there's been such a huge gap between when that was even done that even the old peer-reviewed stuff is so obsolete now that it doesn't hold up, as does hardly any history of Jesus stuff from back then either. Like Shirley Jackson Case's book is amateurish by current standards, right? Like by the standards of the time, it was top of the line. But nowadays it's it's obsolete. And that's a pro-historicity book, and it is obsolete. And even a historicist would admit that. They'd read this like, this is really out of date. And the same, you could say the same thing for Dreves and the other peer-reviewed scholars of the time that were doing mythicism way back 100 years ago. So I don't think studying the history of mythicism is helpful for the actual peer-reviewed version of mythicism. Peer-reviewed version of mythicism is dealing with like serious scholarship, serious methods, doing it properly, and using proper methodology and actual documented verifiable facts and things like that. And the history of mythicism has very little of that. It has some of that, but very little, unlike the history of Jesus, which also has a lot of false stuff in it, but at least it's like, not crank false stuff, right? It's stuff that evolved over time as people proposed ideas and questioned them and so on, and it evolved over time. So that history is different from the history of mythicism. So I don't find the history of mythicism terribly useful. And to give you an example of that, when there was one of the videos we're talking about today is Chrissy Hansen did on just mythicism and Marxism. And she makes a key point in there, which I also made in my article on Chrissy Hansen's reviews of my stuff. Which is that was all crank. Like it was all propaganda. It was all basically endorsed, if not funded, by the USSR. These were not serious peer-reviewed journals or books. These were like Marxist wackadoos doing the state business, right? And so it's completely useless, right? This is not serious scholarship that's trying to get at the truth. This is propaganda. We just can't use it. So that's why I never cite or use, and we're not in any way influenced by any Marxist mythicist, because they're all useless, right? They're as useless as Arcaria S or Atwill or anything like that. So understanding the history, I think it's interesting, and I think it's great listening to Chrissy Hansen go through the history of Marxist mythicism, but it's of no use to us answering the question of whether Jesus existed or not, basically.
When Chrissy was talking about that, I got a lot of, I guess, indications that it's similar to the whole atheism versus state atheism conversation, comparing like the mythicist work in the USSR and all that to, modern mythicism, which I feel like is the way that she was kind of leading the audience in the narrative. As I listen, because I listened to 2 interviews that she did recently, which was like, I think about 4 hours worth of content.
Yeah, pretty much. And one of them was just on Marxism. And the other was on the whole picture with a little bit on Marxism. Which kind of repeated some of the stuff from the other video. But this includes, by the way, Chinese mythicism. So I found some lists, and Hansen herself has done some lists of Chinese mythicists, but they're all Communist Party of China. So this is useless, right? This is not serious scholarship. This is not peer-reviewed scholarship. You can't trust this stuff. It's unusable for that reason. So it's interesting to see that it happens, but it doesn't have anything to do with peer-reviewed mythicism today. We're not using their work. We're not doing the same thing they're doing. Our theories aren't the same as theirs. So like there's no etymological, there's no like historical causal connection. So it has it's use to that. And you could think of it, and Chrissy does do a good job of showing how it sort of originates with Dreves, who's this German, Arthur Dreves, who's this German scholar who's probably the most accomplished mythicist doing serious mythicism, like peer-reviewed scholarship in the early 20th century. And his stuff influences the Marxists, and then their stuff influences the Communist Party of China, and separately influences the threads that lead to Atwill and Dorothy Murdoch, and thus eventually to Doherty and Carrier and Lataster, right? But they're growing separately. There's no cross-contamination, none of the Marxist stuff is even talking to or influencing the stuff in the West. So it's just a separate kind of weird thing, but it's more comparable to the crank mythicism in the West. So it's the Marxist and Chinese stuff is more like Dorothy Murdoch and Joseph Atwill than it is like any of the peer-reviewed stuff, whether even Drev's, right? It's less like that stuff. It's more of the like exaggerated crank things and bad arguments and fallacies and things like that.
Yeah. I guess to sort of lead into some of the issues that both you and I had with both of those interviews, one of the things that Chrissy goes through is, what was the earliest evidence that we have of mythicists existing, or rather, maybe not mythicists in the modern sense that we understand them, but just people that didn't think that Jesus actually existed on Earth, that he
or at least doubted it, right? Questioned it, right? Yeah,
right. Yeah, and so we've got our first clip here from Chrissy, and she's talking about the dialogue with Trypho and a section of that people regularly tout as like evidence that there are at least some people that don't think that Jesus ever walked on the earth. So did you want to like say anything before we watch the clip, or you want to just go ahead and watch the clip?
Just very briefly, like from what we were just talking about, the one thing that I did miss, I think was missing from Chrissy Hansen's presentations, is she does a lot of like bibliographic documenting of this stuff, but doesn't do much showing influence, right? Because you have like the Atwill thread is completely different from the astrotheology thread of Murdoch, which is completely different from the thread of Doherty, right? So there's clearly different traditions with different influences going on. And she didn't do any of that. And so, I mean, that's a really weak criticism. It's not a big deal. Like what she's doing is still fine. But what I would have liked to have seen that I thought would have been more informative is to show the sort of causal connections and the way it influence. So for instance, where is Doherty getting some of his ideas, for example, and then tracing those back to the 19th century? That doesn't mean that Doherty's replicating what they're doing back then. He's doing better work than they are. But you could at least show sort of like how the ideas get winnowed down and how bad ideas get shuffled away. And then the good ideas, survive the process of selection, right? You could do a history of that, but she didn't do that. And she didn't really distinguish the different threads, so like the Atwill thread versus the Dorothy Murdoch thread, much less the Doherty thread. Like where did these separate? Where do they come from? How did they arise? Like that would be an interesting project in itself. It's not what Chrissy Hansen's doing, but what she is doing is still useful and commendable in terms of like at least documenting this stuff, because then you can go to her work. You've got the bibliographies, and now if someone wants to do the causal history, they can use her work to build on that. And that's what good scholarship does. Like it creates stepping stones that other people can build on. So that is valuable. And I want to give her credit for that. Before we start like criticizing her. So, so let's get into that.
Yeah. I know that you've mentioned before how Chrissy's work can be kind of like, I guess good on one hand, but also bad on another hand.
Yeah, she's a very competent amateur, probably the most competent amateur I know. She's definitely on par with Doherty. Like Doherty was doing surprisingly good stuff. Like I think he just had a bachelor's, maybe a master's in Greek. But he was doing like I said, dissertation level work. And I think Chrissy Hansen's definitely on par with that. And so she does do good work. I think that she makes mistakes and has a problem with the truth sometimes. But that doesn't, we can isolate the things that we find wrong or maybe dishonest or whatever, but that should not taint everything she does, right? Like, so it's not like everything she does is garbage. She's doing a lot of good scholarship. Like her peer-reviewed papers are decent papers and are useful just for the bibliographies alone. And that work, that makes, like, that's what scholars do. And that's what makes the papers useful for that purpose. But you do have to read them critically and really fact check some of the stuff that she does and some of her logic to definitely vet it. But then that's true for a lot of scholars. So I could talk about a lot of really terrible scholarship that nonetheless passes peer review, but it's still way, way above the sort of crank stuff that's being poured out on the internet and all the stuff that isn't passing peer review, right? So she deserves credit for that.